Good.
Good lunch? Good camp? My name's Eric Peterson. This is Continuous Delivery Ain't Just Automation, which is in contrast to Greg Anderson's talk yesterday in this room called Automate Your Automation. We're going to be talking about slightly different things. Before I get started, I kind of want to get a feel for everyone in the room. Who's kind of the DevOps person at their organization? Got one? Who's not a DevOps person, just like a developer or developers? Yeah, mostly
Webmaster.
Webmaster, classic title. Okay, do people mostly come from agencies, like freelance work, or do you actually work at companies? Companies that don't do client work? Wow.
Government agency.
Gov, okay. University. We are a rare breed in the Drupal world. It's mostly like your canopies and your chapter 3s and stuff like that. It's good to get together every once in a while. So here's the standard sort of credibility slide. I'm Eric Peterson. I currently work at a company called Tableau Software. I've been working there for 6 years. We do data visualization, analytics. I work in the marketing group specifically, and our marketing department depends on Drupal for the public-facing customer website, basically. Prior to that, I did a lot of freelance work, doing Drupal specifically, starting in the Drupal 5, Drupal 6 era, and I'm also, more recently, founder of a continuous delivery platform called Drush.io. In that role, I actually get to talk to a lot of people doing a lot of neat things and kind of understand what they need to do to deliver more frequently, safer, better, that sort of thing. I can sometimes be interesting. I play music too. Usually I'm not interesting. My apologies ahead of time. A couple of things I want to get out of the way ahead of time. Sort of misconceptions about continuous delivery. One of them is that it's all about being as fast and furious as possible with your deploys to production, and that's like the whole point. And I think the most continuous way you can possibly deliver to production is via FTP, where you're hacking on files that are on prod, and maybe that's not what this is about. This is more, you want to start from a need to deliver quality products, and the means by which you will deliver those quality products is continuous delivery. Start with quality, continuous delivery is how you actually accomplish it. Second misconception that I kind of want to get out of the way is that this is sort of all about tools. If you've ever been to a continuous delivery talk in the past, it's like we deliver often, delivering things fast is great, and then here's 40-slide rant on rsync. And this is not what this is. And oftentimes it's not just rsync either, it's like Chef or Ansible, or you use your Jenkins or your Travis CI or whatever. I want to posit that continuous delivery isn't just a tools and technology thing. It's actually primarily like a people orchestration thing. It's all about culture and motivation and getting people to believe in the right thing, not just we use this tool and we're hiring or whatever. So, to lay out the narrative arc of what I'm going to be talking about here, fundamentally we're looking at like how much code do you ship as your team grows? And the arc I'm specifically going to be talking about is the arc that we did at Tableau. When I started it was 2 developers. We're at like a dozen and change right now, and I'm going to be telling that story of how we tore down some obstacles, started gaining velocity, and started to maybe perhaps sustain that velocity. And along the way, all the sort of problems and hiccups that showed up as well. So let's start at the beginning, tearing down obstacles, very important. Get rid of that ceremony that's slowing you down. A little bit of context. Tableau, so who's familiar with Tableau? Surprisingly, quite a few people. We're B2B SaaS software. We used to be desktop software, still do that. What is the purpose of a website for an organization like that? Lead generation. We have a group of over 1,000 salespeople who we need to give qualified leads so that they can call them and sell them our software. So we're dealing with millions of leads, doing tens of millions of transactions that we want to track for campaigns, and so we need a lot of developers to make sure that our marketing organization, which is quite large, is able to use this Drupal thing in a way that it successfully qualifies leads for these salespeople. It's built primarily on one monolithic Drupal code base, and we need to deliver things quickly. So, what do we do? First, let's rewind back to about 2010, around the time when I joined the company. Things were not so good. Let's diagram the sort of the pipeline that we had. We had your canonical Git repo, your local repositories. We had some inside the firewall pre-production environments. We had a build server. We had a production environment, and we had a place where backups would get stored. And on the surface, this seems like a pretty decent pipeline, right? You like SSH into your pre-prod, you git pull, you look at your changes, you get pushed to your build server, and then you run a deploy script and it goes to production, right? That seems pretty good. Pretty like hashtag legit. But underneath the surface there are a lot of problems, right? In our pre-production environments, one of them maybe runs PHP 5.3, one runs PHP 5.4. One of them uses a particular version of MySQL, another one doesn't. Apache is configured totally different ways on all of them. By the way, good luck actually SSHing into any of these machines. Maybe they're like on the AD network, maybe they're not. Maybe you SSH in, you don't actually have any permissions. It can be very problematic. Backups. Sometimes they just are not reliable. If you want to refresh your pre-prod environments, one, you have to run a series of crazy scripts that nobody knows or maintains. Two, maybe they don't actually end up there in the first place. Then you have this deployment script that was written by someone that we don't know. It was written in Perl, which nobody knows. And it does a lot of crazy things, and sometimes it just doesn't work, right? And then finally, production itself. It's like multi-node. We're syncing code with NFS, and there's like weird Heisenbergian bugs where sometimes code will make it to one server and not another. It's really super problematic. Does anyone like relate with that kind of weird situation? It's painful. Wait a minute, Eric. You said that this was a people thing, right? It seems like you're complaining an awful lot about technology. What are you doing? And you're right to stop me on that. It's totally legit. I don't want to just rant about NFS for a long time. So let's look at sort of the psychology of what's happening there. When your deployment pipeline is unreliable and crazy, it creates a high-stress environment, right? You end up with super risky deployments. And if you end up with risky deployments, you encourage your developers to deploy less often, right? And if you deploy less often, a couple of problems arise. One of them is context switching. If you deploy less frequently, changes build up over time, and maybe that thing that you wrote 3 weeks ago, you don't remember how you implemented it. If it goes wrong in production, you're not going to have the mindset, the sort of glass house that you've built to actually fix it. Second problem, you don't exercise your deployment pipeline very often, right? So if you don't do that, you end up only encountering bugs in the process during critical times when you're actually deploying. Not good, so to speak. Let's also take a look at the organizational structure that produced this. What are the developers responsible for? Basically only that section on the left, your local environment. And then who owns everything on the right? It's ops, right? Or IT, or whoever it may be in your case. Ops is incentivized to keep production up, so they're incentivized to reduce the amount of change that's happening. Developers are incentivized, at least in Tableau's case, like we need to be making lots of changes on production so that our marketers can be productive. How do we reconcile these things? you should, and naturally production is like highly, it's sacrosanct, nobody's touching it. DevOps, right? Aligning your operations and development staff on responsibilities and motivations so that you can successfully collaborate together, right? In the case of Tableau, we had a meeting, I remember it very well, where we came together and we walked through all these things. We designed an alliance and figured out how we were going to work together. For you, it might be different. Maybe you have ops people on your team who are doing these things for you, but maybe you're still feeling that sort of anxiety when you're deploying. Before you go in and try and fix the technology that's like annoying you, talk to the person and figure out where the problems are, come together and kind of go from there. So big takeaway, own your pipeline, DevOps, empower those responsible for changes being made to make those changes themselves. If you're familiar with DevOps Kung Fu, a gentleman by the name of Adam Jacob at Chef, great presentation. Basically, DevOps is not like a way that you do development. It's a cultural and organizational shift about how you do get code to production, basically. So, very important to keep in mind. That's number one. Still tearing down obstacles, moving along that progression. I want to highlight production in particular. Keeping that view sacrosanct is super important, I think. You shouldn't have people monkeying around on production, developers or IT people, right? That's like a healthy view of production. I tried to find that picture of the woman with the salad and she's smiling, but this is like the closest I could get. What you don't want production to be is a black box, right? And by that I mean you want to be able to understand the requests that are coming in, how your application is responding, and why and when it's not responding in an expected way. If you don't have that, you have sort of a black box situation, and it's like a sort of an unhealthy view of production, I would say. Who's ever deployed and got the white screen of death on Drupal? Anyone? Yeah. I assume you. I remember it well when I did it. Bad situations get burned into your memory, right? What do you do when there's a white screen? Like literally, what have you done in the past?
I reverted to the previous code base.
Okay.
And it worked, and that worked.
Okay. What did you do afterward?
It's been a while, but let my boss know.
It's good that your boss didn't know about it beforehand, right?
Went back and looked at what the changes were and then tried to introduce, and figure out step by step where it failed.
Excellent. So revert, go back and debug. Anyone else do anything different for when you get the white screen? Yeah?
We actually put a DNS back to staging.
Oh, wow.
For a good amount of time. So we had a backup of the database on staging.
Nice. That's an interesting strategy. Man.
Forget about the cursing.
Forget
about the cursing.
Cursing. Lots of cursing. Things blow up. I remember when we did it, we didn't have any like Splunk or monitoring or logs or anything like that. So we basically had to do what you did, which is go back and look at the change set, what actually changed, what could have caused it. It's super stressful. And then like as you're debugging things in prod, your boss comes in and is like, what's going on? Why didn't we catch this in QA? Maybe it's Slack, maybe you're getting emails, maybe you're getting called by your CEO or whatever. Why didn't test catch this? I think a common thing in postmortems is like, once we're done, let's write tests to catch the problem that happened, right? I want to challenge that conclusion in postmortems, though. Super simplistic graph. The probability of problems happening in production only asymptotically approaches zero as you increase your test coverage, I think. you're never going to hit zero. You're never going to have an application that will deploy perfectly every single time. So what I want to challenge is this notion of continuous integration, continuous delivery is just test automation. I don't think that's true. I think you should prioritize your monitoring. You should make your app observable in production. And in particular, you want at least sort of a notion of white box monitoring. You want your metrics, you want your logs, you want your traces, so that you don't have to go back to an environment where you can debug and go through the stack traces and stuff like that. You get stack traces in production. There's a wonderful article on Medium by Cindy Sridharan, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, called Monitoring in the Time of Cloud Native. She has a lot of really amazing ideas that I highly recommend you check out. Ideally, you have enough telemetry that you know exactly what's happening in production. You've instrumented your application so that all of the critical paths are covered, and you can slice and dice on whatever you need to do. Hopefully, because this is continuous delivery, you're deploying more frequently than we launch rockets to the moon. But that's sort of the idea that I think you should do. It's ironic. I used to do a presentation with a colleague of mine called First. We went over all the things that you need to do first when you're building an application. Tests first, IATN first, mobile first, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But surprisingly, I've come to a place where actually you should do tests second, if not. In particular for Drupal, I want to give you this advice. I don't know if anyone's ever had to actually instrument an application from scratch. It takes a lot of time, and it's really hard. New Relic has done this for you, for Drupal in particular. They've developed their agent in such a way where it will intelligently pick up all of your menu callbacks, name them appropriately, and you can slice and dice your monitoring data based on whether it's a node view or a views Ajax call or whatever. Literally just install it and go. Just use New Relic. They've done a lot of work for you. Second thing I hear a lot though is, hey, New Relic's super expensive, which is true. Which is why you should use Pantheon, because if you use Pantheon, you get New Relic for free. And they have a whole bunch of other continuous DevOpsy things that's super helpful. That's how we ended up moving to a continuous delivery pipeline from that weird inside the firewall, super salty IT ops person situation. Yeah. Moving along in our story arc, we're starting to gain velocity, we're gaining employees, we're delivering more quickly. We went from like once a month deploys, now we're doing like every couple of weeks, every week, a little bit more regular. We've done the removing, like we've done away with a lot of ceremony and process that was unnecessary, but you will find that people will start to YOLO the destruction of process. There are 3 ways to do things: the right way, the wrong way, and the max power way. In production, people will like swap out containers, or they'll monkey patch files on your server, and it's not because they're evil, right? People aren't evil; they're just lazy, and they'll follow the path of least resistance. And then occasionally, you're just going to want to deploy something super fast. Say there's a widely known SQL injection attack on your content management system. You wanted to put that patch out super quick. In that situation, you don't want to be YOLOing a fast deployment path. You want to be using the same regular path to deployment that you've been using the whole time. And again, this is where your people orchestration skills really come in handy. Certainly there are technological things you can put in place to prevent people from doing that. Don't give them access to production, and they won't be able to swap out containers. They won't be able to patch those files. But I will also say, for Drupal in particular, one thing you might consider doing is disabling your UI modules, your views UI, your field UI, your context UI, whatever, on production. And that'll prevent a lot of that YOLOing, if you will. But if you're going to do that, you really need to look at it from the other perspective. That's just slowing people down. You need to make sure that it's fast for them to do what they need to do. A few words of advice for you to do that. One, really get familiar with the Drupal update API. Drupal core uses it to do schema management, cross-patch and minor versions and stuff like that. But you can use it if you standardize on this, you deploy your own Drush UpDB or whatever. Anything that you need to do through the UI, you can automate. Whether that's variable management or configuration changes, content migration. You can literally import translation like PO files if you need to. Not only do you standardize on this, but you should build a library of sort of helper functions for the common tasks that your developers are doing every day so that they can just copy paste and know that the thing that they're doing will work safely. Natural corollary to this is like you should be using features if you're on D7, D8 configuration management. Very handy. At this point in the story arc, you're probably doing automated testing. And I want to share a story at Tableau of a situation we got into. We had builds running for a long time. We would actually have like 30-minute builds. And eventually something happened and our build time started spiraling out of control up to like 90 minutes over here. And also the build outcome slowly deteriorated. We had a lot of good green builds here and then red, and sometimes they would just literally error out for totally unknown reasons. They would take 90 minutes to error out like they would be able to test. So, what do we do in that situation, right? The whole point of tests is to build confidence in your deploys. If it's taking a super long time and you're not getting any confidence, why are you running them? One thing that we did was we basically removed all of the tests. It wasn't all of the tests, to be fair. It was the ones that were flaky and that we didn't find useful. And we also didn't remove them. We actually just moved them into a separate folder where they wouldn't be executed because we're hoarders. But remember, as you're writing tests, you're building tests, the whole point is confidence, speed. Focus on unit tests if you can. Drupal 7 is really hard to do that, but whatever. Second thing, we actually instrumented our builds in the same way that you instrument your application so that we could identify what was taking the most amount of time and what we could do to address that. Here we're looking at a dashboard that we built on Convent and New Relic. How long is simple test taking? How long is Casper.js taking? How long does it actually take to set up the test in the first place? We run our tests against Pantheon multi-devs, and we found that we have a large database, so it takes a whole lot of time to spin those up. At one point, it was like 30 minutes of the build was just waiting for Pantheon to spin up a multi-dev. So we figured out a way to kind of get rid of that and bring our builds back down to that sweet 20 minutes to the right in the duration there. Takeaways. You should relentlessly focus on the speed of the things, how long it takes for you to get from your local environment to production. Humans will follow the path of least resistance. Make the fast path the right path so that you aren't having to do those crazy things when emergencies come up or when people get lazy. Continuing on, we're still going up that slope toward continuous delivery nirvana or whatever. A natural tendency is to completely automate the process, right? You push code to your version control system, it triggers a build, the build passes, and you're like, great, I'm going to push it to production. This is entirely possible to do. It's actually pretty straightforward if you use CI services, Travis, Circle, Jenkins if you're sort of on-prem. But I would argue that bad automation is often worse than no automation at all. This is a pretty mundane example, but you could even think a year or two ago when Uber, I'm going to use the word again, YOLO'd an autonomous vehicle test in downtown San Francisco, and it ran a red light through a pedestrian intersection with a person in the car who just like was not paying attention or whatever. So I would argue that you shouldn't necessarily make it the goal to completely automate your deployment pipeline from end to end. Semi-related, as you start deploying more routinely, people will start to see it as routine and kind of wander away as you're deploying things, right? It can be a problem. It's kind of a natural tendency of people. So I think you should have a deployment button. If it's not a button, then it should be like a command that you run. Like you should have someone actively engaged in doing the deployment still. Usually people won't have a button. Usually it's like a single command that you run on the command line. Pantheon has Terminus command line, Acquia, BLT, lots of ways to do it. Even this, I think, is slightly problematic. One, people forget things. Did you remember to run that grunt build command? Did you run it with the right flags? Did you drush up DB? Did you CCL? Did you do that in the right order? So a certain level of automation or scripting is definitely important. The other problem with being on the command line is sort of all of the context that you don't have about things that are happening in your environment. For example, what am I actually deploying? I don't know. Is someone actually doing something on staging right now, and am I accidentally going to deploy that to production? Is there an incident going on right now? Is AWS down? Is someone actually already deploying? Am I stepping on someone's toes? So solving these problems is super important, I think. Chat is a pretty common way to do that. All of that context already exists in your Slack channel or your HipChat room or whatever. There are some nice manual ways you can ease your way into this. Right now what we do a lot is just like the person who is deploying will say in the room, hey, by the way, we're deploying. Here's a link to the diff, and then @mention all the people who are mentioned in the diff, so that people who know what could go wrong are on call to sort of take a look if things go wrong. But remembering again, people are lazy. If you have to add in those manual steps, it's not necessarily going to happen. This is sort of the area that I'm primarily focused in right now is getting people to be engaged and having that context, and that's sort of what this startup idea that I'm working on called Drush.io is all about. Basically, suppose you're in Slack. You're saying, okay, I'm going to ship this thing to stage. They're like, ship it, sweet. Then you just run a command, Drush.io run deploy. It asks for some information. You let it do its thing, and it will come back with the information that you need right there. It's still in beta, so if you're interested and you're a Pantheon user, come talk to me. I'll give you a little coin that will give you access. But this isn't like a sales pitch or anything. So I think just the key is that you should automate things tastefully. You should design your processes to keep humans engaged and aware and informed. Now, moving on toward the top of the arc here, sustaining velocity. I'll be honest, I don't even think that Tableau, the marketing department, has really hit this point yet. I think this is really hard to do. So instead of giving you advice, I'm just going to give you some of the challenges that we're running into right now. One of them is related to version control and application state. Drupal is a content management system, so it's like the relationship between your database and your application state and your code, which runs the application, is coupled in ways that are unpredictable or very hard to determine. So as you deploy, you create these situations where state may or may not actually change. And if you have developers working in feature branches, they may be working on features and code that will conflict with that state. Dealing with that can be difficult. Naturally, you like rebase your code, you pull down the latest backup from the database, but it can be slow and painful. My only advice, I think, is like make your local tools fast and reliable. Make it easy to pull down backups and spin up a new local environment so that people can iterate more quickly. Next advice, consider, instead of branching in version control, branch in code. Feature flags are a really common thing that sort of more traditional application developers, application engineers do. You can deploy a lot of code in a dark configuration where you're just shipping dead code, and then you can slowly introduce that change using configuration management, essentially. This is really challenging to do in Drupal, if only because It's a little bit all over the place. You might have to sprinkle this in a lot of different places. You might have to dump it into your JavaScript Drupal.settings so that certain front-end features are impacted a certain different way. You have to keep caching in mind your CDN, that sort of thing. It gets really complicated, so I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it off the bat, unless you're on a brand new, fresh project. It's especially hard if your existing monolithic code base is tangly to untangle it into these feature flag chunks. Continuing, one thing you might consider is breaking apart your monolithic code into smaller pieces. That carries with it lots of architectural and technical debt decisions that are sort of up to you, so maybe think about that a little bit before you do it. Our story, we're only about a dozen developers. A lot of larger engineering organizations scale up to hundreds, and eventually you'll run into a situation where there's not enough time in the day to deploy all of the changes that need to be deployed. I don't know if anyone in this room will ever hit that. If you do, consider accelerating the expansion of space-time. But that also has some technical debt associated with it. So choose carefully. Anyway, a lot of these ideas came from a gentleman by the name of Dan McKinley. He worked at a company called Etsy and then Stripe. He's got a lot of great ideas. Some ideas I don't necessarily agree with, but check it out. Push train deploying is a very good idea. Quick recap. Those 5 points. Continuous delivery is the means, not the ends. End is quality. Empower the change makers to make changes. Prioritize monitoring, observability. Focus on speed. And keep your humans engaged. And I think you will be happy. Thanks very much. I'm Eric Peterson. Come talk to me for these little tokens. I'm happy to take questions as well. Thank you very much.
I have a goal of zero downtime deployments in production. And I've done this in the past in non-Drupal environments using Amazon ECS, and it's very straightforward. But I find the coupling with Drupal here to be problematic, with the configuration management to be problematic in this area. Do you have any tips, advice? Where do I go? How do I do this?
So we've run into situations where we have deployments that will take, normally it's like instant, it's like, or a couple of seconds or something, but occasionally we'll need to deploy something that will take a half an hour or an hour or something like that. And these come up often enough that we've developed this strategy of sort of dynamic DNS failover, where you will actually, in your DNS service, will have a health check on your production environment. In case of emergency, if it detects a failure, it can actually go to a completely different environment that has like a relatively recent copy of the database and stuff like that. And for these long deploys, we will just manually fail over to that separate cloud environment, do the deploy here, and then fail back. And this like the switch takes a matter of minutes, and it's completely transparent.
Right. The problem is that we have end users who are adding content and things like that as well. So doing a failover to just the fact that it has a different database. If they're updating that database, now my database content is out of sync. Not my configuration. So, my problem is content and configuration in the database. So I almost have to update configuration on the new one, but keep the content synced between the two that I'm trying to, show game.
A content management system is a challenging thing to update and deploy to. The only other thing I would recommend is spend the time to walk through the way that configuration management is syncing those changes and find out why things break or take a long time, and just fix it in Drupal. Contribute the change back up to Drupal, because a lot of people are probably running into the same issue. Anyone else? Awesome. Thanks very much. Appreciate it very much.